Hey guys, got three games to share with you that are played against an opponent from Russia, rated in the 1100 to 1200 range. And what's interesting about all of these three games is that my opponent takes the same kind of approach, of quite a slow approach to the opening in each game. And you'll see how we go along. So three games. The third one is the longer of the three, but let's go through them. This is game number one. So we have e4, e6, the French. And now look at this. So he does this in all three games, right? Moves out the first pawn, 2 spaces, and then the second pawn, just 1 space. Now, what he does in each case is blocks off one of the bishops. So here, the king's bishop is going to struggle to get out into the board. Quite often you want to get this bishop out before you play this move, but let's see how the game goes. So I play d5, and we have an exchange of pawns on d5, and now the bishop comes out because it's only got one square it can go to, and goes in front of the king. So I develop my knight to f6. My opponent plays knight to f3, now preparing to castle. I come down with my bishop and pin this knight. Well, it's not really pinned. I mean, it's looking at the bishop behind it. And now, oddly, the knight retreats. And this is kind of typical of my opponent's play. He's quite kind of conservative and feels like he's trying to block rather than land any punches. And the initiative, I think, is very, very important in chess. So you can see what he's doing here. By retreating the knight, he's now got a discovered attack against this bishop, right? So he's got 2 pieces looking at my bishop, and my bishop is defended only once by this knight, all right? However, this bishop can be prevented from making the initial capture. And one way of doing that, and I'm quite pleased with this move that I found, queen to e7, right? Now pins this bishop. It's in an absolute pin, so it cannot capture my bishop because it would put white in check, and that would be illegal. So now the tables have turned somewhat, because now I've got 2 attackers on white's bishop, okay, and it's defended twice by queen and king. My opponent now castles, and this is an error, because now I can simply capture the bishop. So I've got a fork on queen and rook. Now if queen takes my bishop, I recapture, okay, and I win the queen. And the rook then can't come to e1, even though my queen and my king would be in line, because my queen can just capture the rook, and that would be the end of the game, okay. So my opponent now plays queen to e1. I grab the rook, so now the queens are facing off against each other. And if queen takes queen, I've got bishop takes queen, and then white would capture my bishop, okay? But I would be up, I think, a whole rook at this point in time. So my queen then captures on there. I bring out my knight, and my opponent now resigns, realizing that he's down a full rook. Okay, so that's game number one. Again, just be aware of this quiet move at the start. I mean, we can't say that that's what cost my opponent the game, but it is typical. So game 2 now. So now I've got the white pieces, and we have the Vienna. And look at this again, the quiet, conservative d2. Again, blocking off the king's bishop. Right, so I come out with a piece. So I now have 2 pieces developed. My opponent doesn't have any. And again, he brings his bishop in front of the king, because it's only got the 1 square to go to, right? So this is, kind of a London style setup, but in the London, you have the bishop in front of the queen, actually, here, and the knight would go to that square. But this is just, it feels like my opponent is already in a cramped situation. So I'm going to come out with my queen to h5, this wayward queen attack, and my opponent now blunders with knight to f6, hitting the queen, but doing nothing to defend f7. So I capture f7 with a queen. King to d7 is now forced. Now what I meant to do here, I was looking at different moves, and I had my bishop selected, and I actually mouse slipped, and withdrew my bishop all the way back to f1. So I think bishop into there would have actually forced the king out into the board here. So that's the kind of things I was looking at. So now black plays queen to f8, and I withdraw my queen to b3. So definitely looking at more attacking ideas. The king's been forced to move. There's going to be no castling on black side of the board, and I want to keep my attacking options open. So king retreats to d8. I develop my knight, and now we have b6. So why did my opponent make that move? I can only imagine he wants to put his bishop out here on b7 with a couple of attackers against this pawn. Possibly that might be the idea. So now I strike out. Okay. It's important when your opponent's lost castling rights, you want to open up the middle of the board and go after that king. And there's no point hanging around. So I want to open up lines to the king as quickly as I can. So pawn takes, knight takes. Now bishop comes here, and my opponent does have two pieces looking at this pawn, but my opponent has missed something very important. Very, very simple tactic. Wins the game, knight to e6 with a fork on king and queen, and again we have resignation at that point. So my opponent here was thinking only about his own ideas and skipped the part where you read the board. So right now this move isn't really on because it's defended by the bishop, but then queen would take bishop, and but with this move the knight is just free to go straight into e6 and win the game. Okay, so game number 3 now. Now my opponent has the white pieces again. We have e4, and now I play e5. So I'm trying to mix things up. Don't want to play the French. And again, okay, but this time, yep, it's the same. It's the king's bishop is left with only one square to go to. Right now, knight to c6, knight to f3, bishop out to c5. And again, the bishop just moves in front of the king. Okay, so I don't know what he's trying to do with this, tight kind of close setup, but he is going to run out of space. So here I play a prophylactic move. I want to prevent his bishop or his knight from coming to this square. So white castles. I now push d6, getting ready to bring out my light square bishop. We have the other bishop comes out to d2, and now again, the importance of the initiative. My opponent has castled relatively early, so he's declared his intentions. His king's going to be on the king side of the board, and again what I want to do is I want to open up lines towards this king. Notice that my bishop here is on a nice diagonal, right? So it's been there for a little while, and it's lined up with my opponent's king. So we have pawn takes, bishop takes. So now I've got 3 pieces developed. My opponent has also 3 pieces developed and is also castled. So he's ahead in terms of development. But again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to grab the initiative and launch an attack. All right, so we have knight to c3. I bring out my knight to f6. There's a pawn push here. So maybe he's anticipating that I'm going to castle long, and maybe he's planning a pawn attack up that side of the board. So queen d7 now. Lining my queen up with this bishop, there may be potential there. And rook to e1. And now, I would think about castling, and I can actually castle either way as well at this point. But I decide to come in, so I've now got knight and bishop looking at this f2 square because the rook has just moved from f1 to e1. So I'm threatening to capture that with the knight and attack the queen, or with the bishop and attack king and rook together. My opponent pushes h3 to try and kick the knight away, but that pretty much just forces my hand. And I have knight here now to f2, and this is now a blunder by my opponent. Okay, so you can see my knight has moved into a situation where it is actually preparing a discovered check. Okay, now with moving the queen here, it should really have moved the queen to b1. Moving the queen here then enables knight takes d3. So the knight is then attacking the queen, and it comes with a discovered check. So my opponent has to do something about the check and would lose the queen. Now I saw this, but I also thought, well, let's try an alternative attack, which I think is probably incorrect. The engine would say this is a missed win. You had the opportunity to grab the queen. So I capture with my bishop on h3. So what I want to do is if he recaptured with a pawn, I capture with the queen, and there's pretty much an unstoppable mate there. However, my opponent now found a good move. So if I was playing completely by the book, I would have considered what options does my opponent have at this point. He doesn't have to capture the bishop with the pawn, right? Because he then found bishop to e3, right? And that now blocks my defense of this knight, and threatens to take my bishop. So I grab his bishop, queen captures, but now I spotted this and I have knight to g4, now attacking the queen. So the problem with this move is that it blocks off my bishop's escape. So I'm going to lose material. Queen moves out of the way. And now I decide this is a desperado capture. So I decide let's take out the final pawn that's in front of my opponent's king. There's no reason to allow white to capture my bishop. Yeah, his pawn would go onto the edge and the king would be to some degree exposed, but this is a bit more forcing, right? King takes bishop, and now I simply castle. My knight is safe, everything's relatively secure, but look where all my opponent's pieces are on the opposite side of the board from his king, right? Only this knight is there. So now he moves his knight backwards, which is a bizarre move, really bizarre move. I mean, this knight coming in would have been good. The queen could have moved off the back rank. He wants to engage his rooks. He wants to get his pieces around his king for safety, but he retreats the knight. Okay, so now I go in with a check with my knight. King comes across. So now the knight is under attack. So I move the knight again with check. Now offering up the knight for this bishop. It's defended by my queen. Bishop captures, queen captures. And now my opponent has still got all his pieces kind of not around his king, and he's got a queen up in his space as well. So we have attack by the rook on the queen. Times like this, it's very important to consider all your options. Rook h to f8, check, right? And my opponent really only has one move here, which I think is king to e3. But that would have fallen probably queen to here, and he's going to be in a lot of trouble whatever he does. Now he makes a blunder, moves the king back to e1, and now queen takes rook, and my opponent resigns again. So I just thought those three games were interesting because they show kind of the importance of launching an attack when your opponent has played quietly, when they've been quite conservative and defensive. You can take the initiative and launch an attack if the attack is going to be convincing, as it turned out to be in all of these three games. So that's really something that I'm working on at the moment with my own chess, is knowing when it's time to go in for the attack. Simon Williams has coined this term premature attaculation, where he says that a lot of players will initiate an attacking sequence but too early, so when they haven't got enough pieces lined up, when they haven't finished developing and stuff like that. But that's why we say on the checklist, are there any immediate threats or opportunities? And when you see an opportunity, you should go in if it's going to get you an advantage, right? If it isn't going to win you some kind of advantage in the game, preventing your opponent from castling, accelerating your development, capturing material, that kind of thing. If there's no significant advantage, then don't do it, right? But at the same time, if there is an advantage to be gained, you should go in with the attack. So there you go, three relatively short, interesting games. So thought you might find those inspiring. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.